Welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and Tesla 369. This is our first episode of 2025, moving on from the last episode we did last month in December. This episode is called Staying on Course, Did the Phoenicians Sail to America? And it's based on an article that was obviously researched and written by Phoenician Hunter. So welcome, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello, it's good to be back. It's been quite a break. As you mentioned, it's been a month since our last one, so lots happened.
So let's get straight into it. What are we talking about today?
Before we get to the article, I just wanted to discuss some things that have been happening, in my life and around the blog. Over the festive period, I haven't been producing much content. Like I said, it's been 4 weeks since our last podcast. So yeah, I apologize to subscribers who were looking forward to reading something over the festive period, but I've just been involved in a major move. So I moved homes. It took all the best part of 3 weeks. So
I'm sure your subscribers and listeners to this podcast understand that Christmas and New Year is particularly busy, and especially if you are moving home, that would make it probably 10 times as worth. So. But it's good to have you. It's good to have you back, and I'm really eager to get stuck into this because it's going to be an interesting one. So let's get straight into it. Maybe we can start by if you can tell us about the theory of Phoenician contact with America. That's probably a good starting point.
Yeah. Okay. So throughout my studies of the Phoenicians, I constantly come across these rumors of, Phoenicians traveling to distant lands, including lands that weren't discovered by Europeans, until the modern era, like the continent of America and parts of Asia and even as far as Australia. There's rumors, there's evidence that can be debated, but there are signs there as well. That intrigued me, and I wanted to look into it a little bit more and see if if it was plausible. The idea is that, Phoenicians or Carthaginians, which was a Phoenician colony in the West. Carthage became the Phoenician homeland after Alexander the Great had destroyed Tyre, right, in the East. So, yeah, the theory is that they traveled from there and discovered America. And these scholars and researchers and historians have been debating this since the 1800s. And a number of curious inscriptions and, writing and artifacts and even signs of mining activities have been discovered throughout North and South America, since it was colonized by the Europeans. So, there are signs there that something's afoot. So, I mean, some researchers also claim that it was, in fact, the Phoenicians that brought civilization to Mexico and Central America. So, influencing the great civilizations of the Olmecs, Aztecs, and Mayans, with some of their structures, even, like the pyramids, some of their astronomical ideas, writing style. So, there's this persistent idea of this connection between Phoenicians or a Semitic race discovering America in ancient times. Okay. And also, which surprised me, I found that part of the Norman faith, which is a sort of a branch of Christianity, but Christians don't consider it part of Christianity. The Mormon faith believed that ancient Israelites sailed to America. So that is part of their doctrine. Yeah. So when we say Israelites, we're talking about the Semitic people, Canaanites, still talking about that region there. So there is probably some truth in what they're saying there.
Okay, so what I've read, not only in your article, but in other research and other writings, it's that the Phoenicians were known to be very secretive in terms of the voyages. So is this fact? Is this true? Is this what you've read and you've researched?
Yeah, I've come across the same idea, and being merchants, they were very secretive of where they would get their merchandise and their resources to exclude competition. If you found a gold mine, you're not gonna announce it, basically.
Yes.
So that is the practice that they upheld. The Phoenicians were known to keep their voyages and their knowledge of countries a secret, and they also would come up with these elaborate stories of. This is what I've been told. This is what I've read, of like sea monsters. When you see those old maps with sea monsters.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, apparently that idea comes from them. So, don't go in that direction because there's a giant sea monster that will,
Yeah.
devour you or whatever. And another one was suggested that the Phoenicians were the ones that actually came up with the flat Earth theory.
Okay.
Yeah, to scare sailors from venturing too far and then, falling off
Okay.
the edge of the Earth.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
well, that's interesting, and we won't go into flat Earth theory in this podcast, but there's obviously a lot to
please,
talk about
no.
there. So tell us about your research specifically and what you found.
Okay, so touching on what I said earlier, I wanted to investigate if a voyage from particularly Carthage in North Africa to America could be plausible, right?
Mm,
In ancient times. So what the experts say about long distance sea voyages is that you need basically four essentials to make it possible.
mm, mm.
So these are, having a sturdy ship, a ship that can withstand that kind of journey, sea charts or maps, right? Something called the cross staff,
Yes, I
right?
want to say something about
And
that. Yeah.
okay, and a magnetic compass,
Mm,
right?
mm, mm.
So, I set out particularly looking at these four things in detail.
Okay, that's interesting. That can we possibly start with the cross staff because
Yeah.
we all know about ships, we all know about magnetic compasses, but I think the cross staff is very important. And for our listeners, those that aren't aware, the cross staff is actually a navigational tool that was used to measure the angle between the horizon, the horizontal plane, and a celestial body, such as the sun or the pole star, for example. And so, by knowing this angle, a navigator, a sailor, the seafaring people, could then determine latitude and direction, which is how they obviously got to where they were going. So, can you maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of what how
Yeah.
important the cross staff is in that?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up the pole star because the pole star or Polaris was actually known by the Phoenicians, and they used that as a navigational tool to be able to sail at night. So,
Mm-hmm.
that was their point of reference. So they were already aware of that. So what I found was that the cross staff, according to the official narrative, is invented in the 14th century, right? But some researchers suggest that its origins can be traced to the Chaldeans. So we're looking at Mesopotamia area,
Mm.
Babylonia, the Chaldeans around 400 BC.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
So, and that to me makes sense
Mm.
because the Chaldean priests and even the Babylonian priests used it for astronomical purposes, to study the celestial bodies. And this is where we get the signs of the zodiac. And
Mm.
obviously they needed to have a tool to be able to, calculate and get the coordinates. So the cross staff would have been used for those purposes.
Right.
So then what I found was that the Chaldean Empire for a short time ruled over the Phoenician cities. So there's that contact. So the Phoenicians probably learnt that from them.
Mm.
And then taking that technology, they would have adapted it for, navigational use rather than
Mm.
just studying the stars like the priests would have done.
And that would have been obviously such a wealth of knowledge to have at that time. You can compare it to the internet. The
Yeah.
internet has created a much smaller geographical space, so to speak. So this is what they did, obviously way back when, which is amazing. So
Yeah.
okay, so the cross staff, I think you've given a very good historical description there. But there was something that you wrote in your article which I found quite interesting. You mentioned Phoenicians before Columbus expedition. What was that expedition? And this is obviously Phoenician ships, I would guess. Can you maybe elaborate?
Yeah, good. So one of the most repeated claims, right, from experts about, the contact between Europe and America was that the ships weren't adequate enough to make that voyage in ancient times, right? And the ships wouldn't have been able to withstand the conditions of the ocean.
Of
So
course.
keep that in mind, and we'll go back to that
Mm.
later in the podcast. So what the Phoenicians before Columbus expedition is, there was a British adventurer named Philip Beale.
Mm.
And he set out to prove that an ancient Phoenician ship could make that voyage.
Okay.
Right. So what he did, he and his team, using the knowledge they gained from a Phoenician shipwreck off the coast of Spain, they made a replica of that ship. So it's a 2,000-year-old Phoenician ship,
Mm.
and they made a replica as accurately as possible. Also using traditional methods.
Okay.
So, not using the technology we have available today, and local materials to make it as authentic as possible, right?
Okay. Mm.
So that's what the expedition was called. And after 5 months of traveling over 6,000 miles, they successfully reached the Americas,
Okay.
from North Africa. So he proved that it could be done. And he also proved it could be done with the current conditions of today's oceans, right?
Okay. Okay. And this was only 5 years ago too. This was in 2019.
Exactly.
So this
Yeah.
was this was very
Yeah.
recent.
Yeah. This isn't in the article, but I'd like to mention it here, is that so he did a sort of test run before he embarked on that voyage. And the test run was he traveled around the African continent,
Mm.
starting from, I believe it was Egypt, and went all the way around, because that was also a trip that the Phoenicians apparently had taken as well. So there was
Mm.
rumors that they had sailed all around Africa. So he wanted to prove that they could do that. So that was the first step. And when that was successful, he said, okay, let's take the next big step, which was to go to America. And
Okay.
that was successful as well. So I mean, he proved to himself and a lot of doubters that it was possible. But what I find is that this kind of information has not made the mainstream. you
Mm-hmm.
know, and you would think something like this,
Well,
that could change, the ideas of the way we view the ancient people in the past
yeah.
would be big news.
Well, we know how information has been kept from us, not just in this instance, but a lot of other cases that we could obviously mention. But if I can play devil's advocate just for a moment here and say, well, okay, so it was clearly demonstrated, Philip Beale and his team clearly demonstrated that the Phoenicians had the ship capabilities to reach the
Yep.
Americas, right? But, and this is where I'd like your specialist advice here, or recommendations. They did have access to a magnetic compass, right? This is from my understanding. And magnetic compasses weren't, they were unknown during, for ancient mariners. So how did he get over that? How did he tackle or justify that?
Okay, so he did admit in his journal that that was one of the few things that they thought was necessary for safety reasons to make that voyage.
Mm-hmm.
So, but like you said, that casts doubt. Would the ancient mariners have had access to one? So
Yeah.
that was my next point of investigation. Let's look into that now. So, could they have done it without it, or did they have access to something similar? Did
Mm.
they have a compass? What I found was that the invention of the compass seems to be hidden or
Mm.
obscured in,
Mm.
in history. It's attributed to so many different peoples, the Greeks, Phoenicians, Etruscans, Egyptians in the past. And then more recently, researchers say, no, it's attributed to the Chinese or the Italians or the Arabs.
Mm.
It
Mm.
sort of pops up, here and there all over the
Sure.
world. But I look at a historian who I've mentioned before in other articles, is one of my favorite, William Betham,
Mm-hmm.
who seems to be an expert on Phoenicians. And he also associated the Etruscans with the Phoenicians as well. He felt that he was proved that they were either the same race or one derived from the other.
Mm.
He found evidence that the Etruscans had an early working compass, and he mentions a passage. Passage says they had stones that moved as having life.
Okay.
So, when you've got the compass and
Yes.
how it seems to move away
Yeah.
from the other stone.
Yes.
So that was something he found in the ancient texts. But then again, I came across a more recent study, a 2010 study, which found that a magnetic compass had been used by the ancient Minoans, the Greek island
Okay.
of the Minoans, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But they used it for building layouts.
Okay.
And this goes far back as 1900 to 1100 BC. So,
Okay.
quite far. So,
Which I think it's probably a good opportunity to, if I allow me to read a quote from your from the article,
yeah, of course.
which I found interesting. Professor William Samuel Downey said the observations suggest that a magnetic compass, and that's where you mentioned the stones having a life of their own, may have been used for some building orientations, which invites the question as to how the Minoans became aware of the magnetic properties of materials and their uses. The quote continues: "A primitive functional magnetic compass can be made simply by taking a small sliver of lodestone or magnetite, magnetizing it by striking it with another lodestone, and then placing it onto a small floating cork," which, if you visualize that, you know that that's possible and that can easily happen. So, in addition to its use for surveying, a magnetic compass could have been used as a navigational aid at sea. If this simple logical step was made, it would have allowed for all year round trading. So that speaks volumes. Can you maybe expand on that?
Yeah, I've actually put a diagram in the article which
Yes.
sort of illustrates what the professor was trying to say there too. So it makes it a lot clearer. And it's interesting that he attributes that kind of technology or logical step to trading because it benefits the merchants above all, right?
Of
So
course.
this is what I'm all about. This is what my blog's all about. It's about the
Yep.
merchants.
Yep. Yep.
And so this also sort of tells me that if they did have access to it, and more, researchers and studies are finding that the ancients probably did have a magnetic type compass, they would have kept that secret.
Mm.
See, and this is why it's not part of official history. It's not documented. To me, it makes sense that it's not documented. And like I said earlier, it's obscure and it's attributed to, like I said, the Greeks or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
the Chinese, the Arabs, because they wouldn't have recorded it. Because if you've got access to that, everyone else is sailing around the local coast or
Blind.
along the coastline of, a landmass.
Landmass. That's right. Yeah.
They're not going to venture too far, right?
That's right. Mm.
So you've got access to the world, basically. And with that, you've got access to resources, minerals, whatever, materials,
Mm.
new markets. You might find, people in distant lands that you want to buy
Mm.
and sell from, and
Mm.
that's yours. You
It's
don't
it's
have any competitors.
Yeah, it's like the analogy is like discovering the internet and all its uses and keeping it to yourself. How advantageous would that be in this day and age?
Yeah, exactly. Or I go back to, discovering a gold mine,
Yeah.
or an oil well today,
Mm,
I
mm,
guess.
mm.
So yeah, that to me makes sense why it wouldn't have been recorded in
Yep.
history and
Yep.
passed down as, common knowledge.
Yep.
So, and it's interesting that the Minoans, right? So this is going back to the Minoans, is the earliest verified relationship between the Phoenicians and the Greek world actually happened with the Minoan civilization.
Right.
So again, there's that other connection bringing in the Phoenicians with the Minoans. So either the Phoenicians brought that technology to the Minoans, or the Phoenicians took it from the
Mm,
Minoans.
mm,
So
mm,
either way, there was an early contact there as well. So
mm, mm.
I'm going to just repeat myself. If the Phoenicians had possessed the compass, it would have been kept top secret.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
Um,
Uh,
Okay, so we've done the cross staff, we've done the well, obviously the ships we know, we've done the magnetic compass or their version of magnetic compass with the lodestone. It brings us to what essentially is the final element, and that is sea charts and the discovery of that mysterious Piri-Reis map. Can you maybe elaborate our listeners on that?
Yeah, so I had known about this map for quite a while from
Mm,
other studies I've done. So when I started doing this article, I remembered about this map and I said, oh, I wonder if that's related somehow. And it sort of seems to fit in to the whole contact of the Phoenicians with America. So the Peri Reis map is a map of the world, an early map of the world compiled by this Ottoman navigator in 1513 using a number of older maps. So
mm,
he didn't chart the world. What he did is compile this map from a lot of other different maps that people had compiled from the past.
yep.
But the interesting thing is that this map shows parts of America that hadn't been discovered at that point, and also Antarctica,
Mm,
which we are told, was first sighted in 1820. So,
yeah, right. Yeah.
so
Okay.
why is that on the map?
Mm,
And then an archaeologist made the suggestion while studying this map that it must have been drawn before Antarctica was covered in ice.
of course, because it was apparently all green and lush land.
Well,
Apparently, again,
when you look at a map, if you look at a modern map of Antarctica, they show you the outline with all the ice on it, right?
mm, mm.
So if the ice was to be removed, it's actually two islands. It's not one.
Mm.
So if the ice was removed, it's a different outline. It's not the same shape. So
Mm.
that's what this map shows. It shows it free of ice.
Mm.
So that suggestion inspired another researcher called Charles Hapgood, and he wrote an interesting book called The Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. All
Mm-hmm.
right, it was a really
Mm-hmm.
good book,
Mm.
and he came to a fascinating conclusion after researching the Peri Reis map and numerous ancient and medieval maps. He just went about trying to study as many old maps as he could, and he came to this fascinating conclusion.
Can I put some reference to this again?
Yeah.
I know I'm reading out quotes, but I think this gives it a very good foundation for you to expand on. And if I can read this quote, he says that in one field, ancient sea charts, it appears that accurate information has been passed down from people to people. It appears that the charts must have originated with a people unknown, that they were passed on, perhaps by the Minoans, the sea kings of ancient Crete as they are known, and the Phoenicians, who were for 1,000 years and more the greatest sailors of the ancient world. We have evidence that they were collected and studied in the Great Library of Alexandria, and that compilations of them were made by the geographers who worked there.
Yeah, that's quite sensational
Mm.
and telling. And it's also interesting that he also mentions the Minoans.
Mm.
And he wrote this book before that study about the magnetic compass.
Yeah.
That study about the Minoans and the magnetic compass was even conducted. So
Yeah.
for him to make that connection with the Minoans and also with the Phoenicians
Mm.
is quite telling. And it tells me that all these studies and all these researchers are onto something.
Of
And
course.
it's all connected, and
Mm.
it all links up. And he also mentions the Library of Alexandria, where, we're told it was a library where all the knowledge of the ancient world was kept at
Yeah.
one point.
Yeah. Before it was burnt down, and
Burnt down. But see, could have
but
been
again,
burnt down,
yeah.
or they could have moved. I think what might have happened there. Look, my feeling on that, and we're going off topic, but it's an
Let's do
interesting
it.
point. If you steal something of value and then you say it got burnt down in a fire, no one's
Mm-hmm.
going to go looking for it.
Correct.
So if these maps or other knowledge were in the Library of Alexandria, they would have been stolen
Mm-hmm.
and sequestered away.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe they could have burnt the library or just said that it burnt down. Either way, people are not going to go looking for it because they think it's gone. And another big library was the library at Constantinople.
Mm-hmm.
And there's evidence there that I think it was the Second Crusade, or the Venetians raided Constantinople, and I think, and so do other researchers, that they would have taken a lot of maps from there as well. And again, this Ottoman navigator is where Constantinople. So he probably compiled that world map, the Peri Reis map, from older maps found in that library of Constantinople.
Yeah.
It would have been like this researcher says, knowledge passed down from people to people.
Mm-hmm.
And probably the original people who drew the maps were forgotten,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess some people will now use the A word, Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And who were they, and were they real? And I've got two articles on my summation about Atlantis and who they actually were. And I point to the Phoenicians there as well, or some kind of Phoenician involvement there. But again, that's another topic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now this new bit of evidence, about Antarctica and the maps, and sent me in another direction, and I wanted to look at climate changes. Climate changes not only in the ancient past, which there is quite a bit of evidence for, but I wanted to know if there was any in recent times. So again, I was looking, and I found a climate study conducted in 1997. So again, quite recent, where they were looking at ice core samples. And what this team discovered was that there was a dramatic change in weather conditions and surface temperature that started to occur at the beginning of the 1400s. So very recent. We're talking about, 600 years ago,
Yeah. Yeah.
And they say it was the most dramatic change in the last 4,000 years. So that was like, wow. So in summary, what they were saying, that the climate of our planet, including the conditions of the oceans, changed drastically at the beginning of the 1400s, and they continue to this day. So it changed at the 1400s, and it hasn't changed back. We're still in these conditions.
What reference has climate change to do with what we
Yeah.
spoke about before in the Minoans and the Phoenicians, etc.?
Okay. Well, this other researcher that I looked into, who was looking at the same kind of thing, that I quote in the article.
Oh, is this the quote from Sasha Dobler?
That's
Dobler?
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I love reading quotes. I love the
Go
quotes
ahead.
that you put. I love the quotes that you put in your articles, because you're actually verifying your research and you're verifying your insights. So, please allow me to read this one as well. He wrote, "This data suggests that sea travel might have been generally safer and less challenging before the 1400s." Okay, there you go. I've answered my own question. "When we also consider warmer temperatures and drier conditions, and thus better visibility for seafaring with primitive navigation instruments, it becomes not out of the range of possibilities that the northern sea route to Greenland and North America was managed before the 1400s." Okay, I've answered the question, but
Yeah, so he was primarily looking at the voyages taken by the Vikings or the Norse up north, and so again, yeah, the conditions would have been, as has been confirmed by him and other scientists, that the conditions before the 1400s were a lot calmer and pleasant, so they wouldn't have had the enormous waves that conditions that sailors face today.
yeah, that we see with shipping containers, and they have to face
Exactly.
100-foot waves or whatever they are. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe
So
more.
now, when you think back about what we've discussed with all those instruments and the elements, so let's go through it. So you've got specifically the Phoenician ships.
Yep.
In these conditions that they're talking about, before the 1400s, they could have easily have made that voyage. Even though it was proven that you could still make it today, it would have been a lot easier back then.
Of
So
course, yeah.
it wouldn't have been daunting. They would have taken it. So with charting maps would have been a lot easier task, this kind of stuff. So
Well, there were a lot of maps that existed even prior to that time, which would have made it a little bit more navigatable.
yeah,
And again, you've got the maps from even later.
this little bit of evidence just confirms to me how lazy some researchers are, because they say they look at the past and they put current conditions on it. So they say, "Oh no, you couldn't have done that. Look at the waves and the sea conditions. They could never have done it." But did you ever think that maybe the conditions have changed also?
Of
Do you know what I
course.
mean? That's a huge turn of events.
Yep. Yep.
You got to look at the evidence as it was at the time, not as it is today. Okay, the conditions change. Climate change is this thing that people keep debating, and but
The climate's been changing for millennia.
exactly. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at. It's going to change. It has changed, and it'll continue to change. So
Of course, of course.
yeah. So therefore, the conclusion is that the Phoenicians could have easily sailed to America with access to all those elements that we discussed, or even with just access to a few of those elements, they still could have made it based on the conditions alone. So,
if we had more time, I would have liked to delve further into the lodestone, the magnetite compass, because that, and again, I encourage people to not only read your article, which is at phoenicianhunter@substack.com, but also to do their own research about how this could easily have been possible.
there's a lot more in the article than we've discussed.
Of course,
tonight,
of course, yeah.
because,
Well,
we can't go on forever. Plus, I don't want to give too much of it away anyway.
That's right.
But yeah, the lodestone or the magnetic compass, the amount of books I had to look at and read, there's so many, and there's some very good ones discussing that and the history of it. So yeah, it's interesting you brought that up, because that did my head in, trying to compress all that information into a coherent couple of paragraphs.
Yeah, but the idea of the podcasts that we do are not to literally transcribe your articles word for word. It's about having a discussion, opening up people's minds into researching more, but above all, to actually read your article. And like you said, I think in the previous podcast or the one before that, each of your articles are interconnected. So,
Yes.
You talk about Phoenicians, that's your starting point, that's your foundation, right?
Yeah.
So, what I've found interesting is seeing the connections. And, we talk about the Phoenicians and the Minoans and the Chaldean empires, etc. But this, all this is related to, modern day Freemasonry, like we discussed in the last podcast or the one before that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of connecting the dots. Finding out more. Look, is there anything, without giving too much away, is there anything you want to add that we haven't discussed that you've in the article?
Well, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I always repeat myself with that, but this is a large story that I'm trying to tell in little, bite-sized pieces, in little articles, but it's part of a larger story. And you can't just read one or two articles and say, yeah, all right, I get it. I get where Phoenician Hunter is coming from, or I get where it fits into you need to read all of them to get it. And there's so much more to come that I haven't even touched on that I would like to write about. And for instance, this particular article, I sort of wrote almost like I always do, almost a part 2 to this one, which I've titled New World Romans. Did the Romans follow the Phoenicians to the Americas? So while studying for this article, I found evidence of, Roman artifacts in the Americas. And so, that led me to write an article there. And I would like to do another one also, like I mentioned earlier, that there was evidence of the Phoenicians in Asia and Australia as well. So I like to dig that one up and what I found there. So I will write more about this. And also another big one is the mining activities in America that a lot of people ask me about. Actually, it's quite popular amongst Americans. It's something that fascinates them and they want to get down to the bottom of it. And I think that is all part of that same network, that mercantile world network that, the Phoenicians were a part of. And like I mentioned earlier too, there was 2 articles on the Atlanteans, part 1 and part 2, and that sort of connects to this one as well.
Well, I think this has been yet another interesting and very a deep dive into the history of the Phoenicians and their connection to the modern day as we know it. Can I just maybe plug your Substack channel? I think it's important that people know this, not just your existing subscribers, which you have thousands. PhoenicianHunter.substack.com. You can obviously listen to other podcasts that you've posted. You can also go to the Tesla 369 or at Tesla 369 on YouTube and listen to the podcasts there as well if you like that platform better. But again, I encourage people that are listening to this podcast, whether it's on any social media platform, being X, being TikTok, being Instagram, etc., or YouTube, that they subscribe, because you have done years of research and the articles are absolutely amazing to say the least. So thanks, Phoenician Hunter. It's been a great discussion yet again, and I'll look forward to our next discussion, which will be in the ensuing weeks.
Thank you, and we'll be back on a more frequent schedule from now on.
Yes, absolutely.
After our my long
festive break.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for your time, and stay well.